Lovely. Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you guys for joining. It's really wonderful to have you back to us. I know that we've had our very long summer off in September. I ended up doing an Ironman, so we were a little bit delayed starting this winter season for us, but it is October nonetheless, and we have a fantastic speaker with us tonight. So thank you so much for joining. Tonight is going to be a slightly, just move on, slightly shorter session. We usually do 90 minutes, but today is going to be 57 minutes left. So a fairly quick talk, but also some opportunities for you guys to ask questions as well. So without, let me carry on. Sorry, I'm a bit confused over my talk tonight, but that's okay. I'll just crack on with what I'm doing. So we've got 57 minutes. Don't forget, you can use the chat box that is in Zoom. So please feel free to go wild, put your questions in there, do some, heck yes, I agree, everything that you'd usually do that you want to do, that would be great. And we'll keep an eye out for that and start posting anything interesting in there as well. And as you know, we are recording this session, as you can see, so if you're not happy to be shown, then switch your cameras off, or if you'd like to be shown more, then switch your cameras on. That would be nice to see faces. So just putting that out there. And now I'm going to hand over to Ines.
Yeah, just a little bit of humor, right, in the subject of today. And over the last 2 years, we have seen that big shift to remote. And personally, I'm quite biased in a sense because I have been working in a remote or partially remote environment for way long before that. And regardless if we are meeting 3D or 1D, and yes, 2D, there is much for us as Agile practitioners to be cognizant of. And today, we are up for a treat with our guest speaker. And yeah, Mark, just in terms of time, I will hand it over to you to introduce yourself. Some of you may have seen I have this treat at home, like I do, just playing with some props. And yeah, you have been wearing many hats over your career. I've been working in quite diverse industries and teams. So please stop me chatting and just take it away. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Okay, thank you, Ines, and thank you, Helen. As I mentioned, chat, you can see I'm comfortable with chat, but while I'm talking, Helen and Ines will watch that. But please feel free to drop in questions or anything at any time. But I have to apologize. I threw Helen off. That's why she's off, because I told her the temperature here in Orlando. It is currently 28 Celsius. So, and it kind of looks like this right now. And so where I am, and you can see here, you can see the Falcon 9 plume. So those launch often, and I'm about 100 miles from Cape Canaveral, so I get to see that. Oh, spring in London. Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's about that temperature here. All right, let me get slides up so we can get going. All right. So a little bit about me. As you can probably guess from, if you can't see, lots of gray hairs here. So I've been at this for a while. And with that, I've worked in many different industries. I've also worked in government contracting positions. I have worked in small teams and very large teams, scaled teams. And I always had this problem. They were never in the same place. They were always, somebody was always somewhere else. And I used to think that was a problem until I realized I had some ways of helping that along. And that's what led me to write the book with Johanna Rothman and try to share some other ideas for helping people with remote work. Tonight's talk is going to be a little different, though. It's not so much tips and tricks, but I'm going to try to help you think about what is next. What's after remote? What's after Agile? And I'm going to start with a picture from my area. As you know, as you can see from my tag underneath my video, I'm in Orlando, Florida, and we had this little hurricane come really close to us. And this is about a week after the hurricane at one of my favorite parks, less than a mile away. I walk there often, and you can see the water's a little closer to the sidewalk. Usually the water is where those ducks are. And so we were once again thrown into a very unusual situation. And as I walked through, I saw this fellow who was exploring this unusual situation.
Sorry, Mark, to interrupt. I think we're still on the same slide.
Oh, really?
Mm.
Interesting. Are you seeing the fish?
We're not. We're seeing it's not in present mode.
Okay.
Yes, we are there.
Let me try a different sharing then. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so one quick tip with remote, always be prepared to shift, because that will happen. How about now?
Yes,
Okay.
Yes, we see it. Thank
Good.
you.
All right. So as I was saying, I saw this fellow who was exploring this new terrain that he suddenly came across. The water had flooded well upon the bank, and he was trying to figure out, what is this odd place that I'm in? So I refer to this as walking with fish. So as I was walking with this fish, I was starting to take it back to not only what's happened over the pandemic, but also what we all experienced before that. So several of you have probably been in some sort of distributed space. So with that, this is going to be sort of a connect the dots kind of talk, where I want to reflect on first, why was remote so difficult, or has been so difficult for us? What are some of the long-term implications of remote? What have we learned anything? And what's the impact of remote on agile work and agile on remote? And then we'll see what's after that. So let's dive into what makes remote work difficult. So I'm guessing you're familiar with these 5 senses. And I'm curious, when you are in a physical space, co-located, working with other people, which of these senses do you use? And feel free to jump on audio or share in chat.
A lot of hearing.
Yeah. So can you say more about the hearing?
Well, when we're in a cubicle farm with no privacy or anything, and like dozens of people are around me talking about various things, I can hear what they're talking about and say,
Yeah.
wait a minute. I know something about that, and jump right in.
Yeah, it's this sphere of sound that we're in. And same for vision. And right now, I can't see the chat. So is anybody sharing in chat, Helen or Ines?
Yeah, so we've got hearing, we've got most of the senses, sound. Yeah.
I mean, who's been in the office when somebody has warmed up a nice curry, for instance? You definitely smell that when it's wafting through the office. Which of these do you use when you're online?
Sight, mainly.
Yeah, sight and hearing. And it's really kind of like looking through a straw sometimes, it seems like. So I know this sounds elemental, but thinking about how limited we are with remote. So it's not just we're limited to 2 senses, but those 2 senses are squelched. They're reduced quite a bit. So let's talk about another aspect of it, place. So we often associate our work with a place, and it might be we have our desk laid out just the way we like it, or we have maybe a very interesting view, like you see the picture in the upper right there, And maybe it's having that place, or just having others around us helps inspire us or motivate us to work. Or sometimes it can be even our transition, our walk to work, or how we move into work, and moving through that place can help set us up mentally for that being ready to work. And we don't always have that with remote. Or it could be who's around us. And I hear this almost every time. As a matter of fact, also today is the Agile Open SoCal, Southern California event. And they just kicked off about 2 hours ago. And that was the first thing I heard. I miss people. I miss being around people. And that's the thing you hear the most. And that is a huge difference, no matter where we work remotely. Another problem is change. Now, usually we're accepting of change if it's our idea. If we want to change our look, if we want to take on a new role and maybe, change our clothes. I tend to like wearing a collared shirt when I'm working online because it puts me in a work mode. So sometimes how we dress, or how we change the way we dress, or sometimes we want to shape our space and we want to paint it, we want to shape it. And that's difficult to do that as a team working together if we're all remote. But let's connect a few more dots. What are some of the implications from this, or what have we learned about remote? Well, I think the most important thing is choice. Now, Ines showed the book that Johanna Rothman and I wrote, and that was written in a time of choice where people chose to go remote. And in that choice, you can think of it as a spectrum from everybody in the office to everyone remote. You can think of it that way. So here in the upper right in the office space, I would say this is an extreme. So if you look at this picture of the office, in this particular office, there's not a lot of choice. Everyone has the same chair, almost the same lighting. Some get closer to the natural light. Somebody has the same slab, not quite a desk. I've worked in spaces like this. Everyone's surrounded by people, and that could work for some and not for others. But for some of us, we want to be in a different environment. Sometimes having that choice of our own place gives us an opportunity to think more deeply, to be able to also use the space to inspire us. And so why I don't think everyone should be working out in a starry field, some choose to do that. Now, I want to be clear that the pandemic was a whole different type of choice. Actually, it was no choice. None of us had choice in that case. And so it's sort of off this axis. So what you experienced during the pandemic was not really the remote work that many other people experienced before that, if that was your first exposure to remote work. Another thing that you'll hear pop up, and I'm going to plug Pilar since she's here. Pilar has a wonderful newsletter, and she talks about some of these same issues. And I know she's written about focus multiple times. And sometimes it's that, do we have focus time to write, to create, maybe to fiddle with something, just to think or to analyze? Sorry, I put the gratuitous dog picture in there because I just like the dog picture, but yes, he looks like he's thinking deeply as well. But sometimes we need this quiet space. One of the first open plan offices I was in, they were half-height cubes. And at first we all thought it was great because we could talk to each other easily. But then when the developers had to think deeply about some of the different things they were doing and all the different pieces they were bringing together and trying to keep this in their head. It was very hard when conversations were bouncing around about sales numbers and marketing plans and things like that. It was very difficult for us in that situation. So some of us in some types of work do need to have that time and space to focus. And so if you haven't come across this book, this is a great one if you really need to understand focus better. I don't agree with everything Cal Newport writes in this book, but I think it's a good exposure to what is the impact of having more time to think deeply and to be able to really focus on big problems that you're trying to solve. A third thing that you'll often hear about remote work, sometimes it's called balance. Sometimes you'll hear it called work-life fusion. There's other terms. Pilar, have you heard some? I know you've heard some others.
I can't remember now.
I put you on the
Work-life
spot. I'm
balance,
sorry.
fusion.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I
Yeah.
will look for
There's
it.
another one that I
There is
can't
another
think of. Yeah. But this came out just last week from the U.S. Surgeon General, and I thought, you know what? I really can't do any better than this. They did a beautiful job of putting this together. And this is a framework for how to maintain mental health and well-being in the workplace. Now, this is not an in-person workplace. This is not a remote workplace. This refers to any workplace. So, are you safe from harm? Or will you be bullied? Will you be suppressed or shut down if you try to express an opinion? Do you have connection to others? Or is there even a sense of community where you have social support and you feel like you belong there? Their term was work-life harmony. There was another one, Pilar, I couldn't remember what it was. But do you have some autonomy as to when you can be in the office and when you can be out and not disrupt either your work life or your personal life? And do you matter at work? Not just are you treated with respect, but does your work have meaning? If you've dove into any of the work from Gallup, they have a set of 12 questions, which I've used before with some organizations and teams, and that mattering at work is a big part of that. But another part is also, do you have an opportunity to grow and learn? And so not just in your specific job, but do you have the flexibility maybe to explore other opportunities in your workplace? Maybe you've been in a particular position for 3, 5, 7 years, and you're just like, I want to try something else. Do you have those opportunities? So I thought this was just a great one. So I just put it up there, and you can see the URL at the bottom if you want to read more on that. They've got a wonderful website and resources there. All right, so let's connect just a few more dots and talk about how remote might be impacting Agile and Agile impacting remote. So I hear many people talk about these as opposites, but I see them as elements that are blending together to form something new. So in our book, we talk about 8 principles, and I'm not going to go through all these in the interest of time, but for those that have skimmed the book, you'll probably notice that first one, establish acceptable hours of overlap. That's really the only one that applies to remote work. Everything else could apply to a remote workspace, or really just an in-person workspace, or a co-located workspace, excuse me. So being transparent, having an experimental mindset, setting a rhythm, making sure that you're keeping in mind everyone has good intention. These are not new concepts, but in the book we talk about how this could apply in a remote agile team. And I heard a noise there, so I'll pause because I can't see Zoom right now. Was there a question?
No questions. Just to share the link, the URL, but we've shared it. Ines has shared the 5 essential workplace of mental health and wellbeing, guys. So
thank
check
you.
that out.
Thank you.
So that's good.
And you'll have the slides afterwards too. So
brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, I always like to share the links later. So, but another book I want to make you aware of is by Dr. Karen Lajeski and Dr. Richard Riley. So this actually came out in early 2020. This was their 3rd book. The first couple of books are really deep and academic. This one is a little bit of an easier read, and it looks at it's across 15 countries, if I remember right, 38 or 39 industries, and they interviewed everyone from senior execs to just regular workers, and they had some very interesting results after these thousands and thousands of interviews. This concept of virtual distance, or this feeling of separation when you're online, the physical parts of it is actually very small impact. So the distance, the hours, unless you're completely at the other side of the world, of course. But I think now, even with the pandemic, we understand how to manage those. The operational side is roughly twice as impactful. So this is, does everyone have the right tooling to stay connected remotely? Do they know how to use it? Do they have equal access? And can they get easy help? Like I had help here saying, can't see your screen. So that is a slightly greater impact to productivity. But the biggest impact was, how connected is everyone? What's the social connection? And as Agilists, we should definitely understand that cohesion of the team and how we help support that, whether you're a scrum master, a coach, a product owner, product manager, or just a team member. It's really up to everyone to look at, how do we keep everyone together? So some specifics, if you haven't read the book, and if you don't want to read the book, you can go to my website, you'll see some articles on this. But you can do some very simple things in some cases, such as set up a buddy system. And you might have even seen this during the pandemic, because more people were doing this, where if some people were in the office and some people were remote, can you have them pair up that way? So the remote person always had a buddy that they could stay connected with. And this extends to even those facilitating. So for instance, Helen and Ines are a perfect example of the co-pilot pattern. Do you have somebody that can work with you to help keep the group together? And so that's a common pattern that I've seen across many different groups. So when next time you're in another webinar, notice, is there somebody talking and is there somebody driving the tech from behind? So having that co-pilot, but that co-pilot can also spread across different locations where you might have co-facilitators or co-pilots at each location. Even if you are coming back into the office, do you have somebody at each office that can read the body language, that can tell the other facilitators, hey, we might want to slow down. I'm seeing some people that are looking confused here or looking upset. Maybe we should stop and take a break. So that affinity distance is what you want to work on more than anything.
And just whilst we're on, sorry, Mark, to interrupt, whilst we're on co-piloting, a couple of questions have come up. One around, could you talk a little bit more about what pervasive communication is?
Oh, yeah. So let me go back. So there's a difference between transparency and pervasive communication. So in transparency, and this should be familiar if you've been on successful agile teams. It's basically you're willing to be open about everything that's happening within the team or even between teams, where we're sharing both the good and the bad. We're sharing how the impact of one person or one team is impacting another. Pervasive is, are we making sure that the critical information is getting out in different ways? Is it radiating out in different ways? And the best way I can explain this is an example of a senior VP, and this story's in the book. A senior VP I worked with that was brilliant at this. He would put out a blog post on a Monday morning on the topics that he wanted to share. He had his all hands on a Wednesday, usually it was bi-weekly. And then he would have AMA sessions, Ask Me Anything sessions, the following week, a couple of different times, so that people could read about it, they would hear about it from him. And if they didn't feel comfortable asking in the large group setting of the all hands, they could join smaller AMA groups, usually about 10 or so. So you had different, and you could always reach out to him on Slack too. He was very open about that. So any big messages or big changes that were coming, that's how he radiated out that important information. So it's important that you look at what are the different ways that if there's a big pivot in the organization, what are different ways that you can radiate that out so that you make sure everyone gets that message. And if they're confused or need more information, they have easy ways to get their questions back. So hopefully that answered that question.
Could I jump in with a question quickly on
Sure,
pervasive?
please.
So you were talking about pervasive in terms of top down. I'm assuming pervasive also means encouraging bottom up. So
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. So another great example. One of the big problems when you're dealing with multiple teams is, how do you share a great idea? So let's say a team has been experimenting with how they're putting something together. They came up with a great way to do it. How do they share it easily? So that's another example of pervasive communication. So there might be group-wide chat channels dedicated for that. There might be some sort of all hands gathering. There might be, you might even do that mixed in with a hackathon. Say, hey, we have this great idea. We'd love to expand on it in a hackathon approach and build something else using these techniques so others pick it up. So that's sort of another way of pervasively communicate that innovation. So again, and this is from the bottom up, how can you take that bottom up idea and make sure it spreads out different ways? So we used to do that same organization, we used to do those hackathons 3 times a year. So we had an opportunity not only to test out new ideas, but for teams to share that information, because the hackathons were, you didn't have to stay in your team. There were really very few rules. So if you wanted to go work with somebody that you've never worked before, but you've been wanting to try something out, form a team right there during the hackathon and do it. So. All right. So hopefully that gives a little more detail.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, Mike, you had another question around the overlapping of hours. Did you want to ask that?
yeah, sure. So it says establish acceptable hours of overlap. The complexity of that might be the who part of the question. Who gets to decide? Is it the person, the team, the organization, etc.?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Yeah, this one we could debate the rest of the evening, but I'll just put it this way. The further you can push that decision down, the better. So if it's just a team deciding how they need to work together, I leave that up to the team. If it's one team collaborating with another, that's a different issue. And if there's, depending on how they're spread out. If it's, let's say in a typical agile setting where you're doing some sort of review with stakeholders, then you get in the sticky situation of, do you meet when the stakeholders are available, or do you do something else? So there's ways to do something else, a mix of live synchronous meeting like we have here, as well as asynchronous. And so just a quick idea there is maybe you just do short videos, think Loom videos, for instance, or something like that, where you do short clips and people can comment before the live session so that you're getting feedback both a little bit before a review as well as in the review. And then the group in the review can decide, okay, what's next based on all this feedback.
So Mark, the pedantic nature in me would say probably not the lowest denominator, but lowest common denominator. Because if you go all the way to the floor,
yes,
then an individual would decide for themselves what overlap means, which
right,
may be deleterious to a team. So it's common.
Yep, I agree with that. Yep. All right, anything else? No? Okay. Well,
Great, no, nothing else. Thanks.
we're doing great on time. So let me go ahead and wrap up here and see what other questions we have. So on the right-hand side, we talked about what we learned from remote, the importance of choice, the necessity for focus, this idea of balancing or blending or fusing both work and personal. And then from Agile, this is a short list. I know it could be much longer, but the ideas of being transparent in how the work is going, getting feedback on, are we on the right path? Are we delivering value? And certainly, how do we adapt to that feedback? And how do we make corrections, or how do we amplify what's going really well for the team and the stakeholders? And so from that, well, I'll put it this way. For me, years of having the Agile Manifesto in front of me, I actually started seeing elements of both sides kind of tying into the manifesto. So for example, the best architecture requirements and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. That sounds like choice. Maybe a little bit of focus, definitely adaptation, feedback, and transparency, because a self-organizing team needs all of that. So this is where my last 20 plus years of working with remote teams, and mostly software teams, some remote sales and marketing teams and others. But that's, I've started to see these come together for me. So the question I have for you is, what might be emerging? What's swirling around with these concepts of being adaptable, being agile, and also being remote? So one way that I've looked at it is, how can you flip things around? Right now, we often design the teams for the work. But what if you design the work around the teams or together? What if you co-design them? And with that, how would it be more humane? So one of the things I started doing early this year is working with a group of people from the Modus Institute. You may not know that name, but you might know Jim Benson and Tony Andy Maria, who have the personal Kanban book. They've been in the lean and agile communities for many years. But what's interesting and what they've started to come up with is this idea of not only how do we amplify visual management, but how do we make it more humane? So it's not just capturing state and how to move things forward on something like a Kanban board, or what are the big plans coming up, but what's the story behind the work? And what's the story behind how the team is working? And how do we visualize all of that? And how do we visualize the culture and the professionalism and the identity of the team and the individuals? So I'm sorry, I didn't capture the name of the gentleman who just spoke, but that idea of pushing things down to the individual, yes, that can be tricky, but it's also what blends into a team. So this idea of how do we provide some visual tools to blend all this together? So we're getting close on time, so I don't have any really good examples of that. I'll be sharing out more on that later on social media. So I'll be dropping some links there soon. But I will say, and I'm going to plug somebody else's book. So Jim actually released a book that really describes all of this. And the reason I like this book is it's not about following Scrum. It's not about following Kanban. It's not about SAFe. It's not about less. It's really about how do you take all the tools you might have available and your team might have available, and in the context you're in, how do you create the right visual management system? So they've not only done this with software teams, they've done this with construction teams, they've done this in hospitals, they've done this in a number of different places. And this is where I'm starting to collaborate with them, because this actually was the book I wish I'd written before the distributed teams book, because these were some of the things I was thinking about is how, well, I'll put it this way. Everyone asked me to form a distributed agile framework, and I didn't want to do that because I think it really depends on what your team and your organization needs. And there is not a one size fits all, although some will try to sell you that. I think it really is up to the teams and the organizations to come up with that. So to come back to the original question, is remote work an innovation or a downfall of Agile? I don't think it's either. I think it's another step. I think Agile is sort of an evolutionary step in the way of working. I think remote has pushed us in some ways to think about how do we allow choice? How do we allow more focus? How do we allow more balance? And I think it's really up to all of us to look at how we inspect and adapt. And maybe be this fish every once in a while and explore some new terrain. So with that, I want to open it up to questions. And I'm going to change it so I can see Zoom.
I actually have a question.
Hey, Brian.
Hey,
I was
Mark,
hoping
how
it
you
was the
doing?
right Brian Hunter.
Yeah,
So.
long time. Good
Yes,
to
sir.
see you, sir. So one thing we experienced where I work is, we're in this new hybrid model where the company has invited us back 3 days a week if we want, but it's perfectly fine with us still working from home. There's no mandates either way. A lot of the employees have opted pretty much to work at home most of the time, maybe go in once or twice a week. We have some other employees who would very much like to go in 5 days a week, but they're running away from their toddlers and their pets and so
Yep.
more than anything, to be honest. But with so many people being remote and, and this is, we're, 2.5 years or so, whatever it is. One thing I've been noticing, and I'm a product owner, and I see this with pretty much across the board, my calendar is just like packed. And anybody I try to schedule a meeting with or want to talk to or need information from or want to give information to, their calendars are all packed. And it's exponential. The more people you add, the fewer open time slots there are. And I hate that for our development team because those are the folks doing the work, right?
Yep.
We're producing what we all need. In your experience, is there anything we can do to alleviate that? And obviously there's techniques like we can try to, have shorter meetings, but much more focused. We use Slack religiously within the company. So that's actually helped a lot because you can have more asynchronous conversations. Plus there's a history of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering, what would your recommendation be if people's calendars are just full and everybody's on a Zoom session all day long?
Yeah. So, and certainly, show of hands, how many people had that during the pandemic, the wall of meetings? Yeah. Come on. I know many of you did. So it's, you don't want to go back there. I get it. I understand. So
Sorry,
That-
sorry to interrupt, Mark. Would
Yeah,
you
yeah,
mind
go ahead.
stop sharing your screen, and then we can?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's acting a little weird on my end, so I couldn't tell what I was sharing. So this was very challenging for me as an agilist, wanting to have that frequent collaboration, so that acceptable hours of overlap. I've really challenged myself on that principle. So and this is one of the ways I know Pilar, because we've had a lot of conversations around asynchronous work, and Pilar has written some wonderful things on that. What I would say is you need to really look at those meetings. What's the purpose? Who really needs to be there? And how can you capture the information so that those who don't really need to be there can really find out what happened? So since the pandemic, there's probably been like, I don't know, 300-400 tools that have popped up to do that kind of thing. But I think it's really looking at how can you best share information that doesn't need to be real time, that doesn't need to be synchronous. So it really comes to taking a really hard look at those meetings and say, okay, do we need everyone in these meetings? So for instance, on a team I'm on now, it's a small team, but I've done this with larger teams where it's mostly developers. They want their quiet time. And so we've kind of turned the meeting knob down, but I've told them, I said, okay, you've got to start sharing on the board and in Slack what's going on. I said, I'm okay dropping meetings. So it's also been sort of a negotiation. So with that, we've experimented with what's the right balance for that particular team to see, okay, how can we radiate out that pervasive information, that pervasive communication, but not do everything in a meeting. So it takes time, it takes some experimentation to do that. But that's what I would suggest is look at who's in those meetings. Does everyone understand why they're in those meetings? And if they're not in those meetings, do they have a way to really find out what happened without asking anybody? Is there a repository somewhere that they can capture that? And there's a ton of tools, but you probably already have some of the tools to do that, I'm guessing. So does that help, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously those are things we always try to do, but sometimes it just seems overwhelming at times, even with those techniques. And I guess I was hoping you had a silver bullet that would.
Yeah. No,
but obviously there isn't any. And someone had made a comment that we need a kind of a period of silence or period of isolation.
I saw, was it Mike? I appreciate the acceptable hours of isolation. Yes.
Yeah, and
I've gotten that from someone
that where I work, where we're trying, and it's mostly working, but sometimes product organization and tech organization have different hours on different days.
Yeah. Well, so I will say this, and I see there's other questions, so I want to be careful and not skip them. One thing you might want to try to experiment with is, can you do quick video summaries? So I've had good success with those where nothing long, 5 minutes. So you can do it with a free Loom account. That's 5 minutes. Can somebody quickly summarize what happened in the meeting? Because nobody's going to go back and watch an hour-long meeting. It just doesn't happen. They might read notes, but if you can do a quick 5-minute summary and say, and if you want more information, here's the notes, but this is what happened. This is what we decided. This is why we decided it. If somebody can do that and even rotate that around, because the next time, sometime in the future, they might be the one outside the meeting and they're going to be wanting that summary. So, all right. So I want to get some other questions. So Jeff, I think you're next in the queue.
Oh, hello. Well, I just wanted to emphasize a bit more on this async thing, in that one thing that people knew even before this pandemic is if you're working remote, you must emphasize asynchronous communication.
Yes.
Get away from the meetings, get away from the synchronous meetings, really heavily emphasize in every meeting. We all know about the meetings that could have been an email. Well, start making them emails. Start making them like text, and okay, if we're having a meeting for everyone to say what I did yesterday, what I'm doing, just send a message for that.
Yeah.
Do
Well,
asynchronous communication as much as you can, and then face-to-face for the really valuable stuff. Go ahead.
yeah. So Jeff, I would add to that. Man, I hate back and forth in emails. So that's why I say it helps to have a discussion around what's going to be the best way to capture that. Now, if you're in a large organization, yes, you probably need to mandate that. But if you want some great examples, hit me up later. I can point you to GitLab and others where they've documented what they do and how they've summarized. So for instance, another one, Automatic, that produces WordPress and a lot of web-based products. They created a version of WordPress called P2, which is their sort of documentation system. So it's like a blog, but it's just for teams. And the idea is you can have design discussions and everything else going back and forth, and people can go back and watch the record. So I'll say this now. I've used P2 in an async book club that I've run before. I'm probably going to run one again early part of next year. And so if you want to experiment with async, just email me afterwards or contact me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I'll get you plugged in so you can try it out. So yeah, I'm with you. So Pilar.
Yeah, I want to follow up on all this stuff because I think it's really interesting and what Brian is saying. And one thing that I've been thinking of is that in addition to substituting some of the stuff that happens in meetings with asynchronous, we can also really start to be creative in the structure of meetings and how we mix both mediums. So one thing that I'm seeing is what I've seen is, for example, and this might be that in Agile, you have to do it like this. I'm not an Agilist, but I've seen, for example, that if before the pandemic, people had meetings in their team with 15 people, that's what they do now all the time. They still meet with 15 people. Whereas if you start to think of some of the facilitation techniques that have been used in in all kinds of spaces, like the 1, 2, 4 all, when you discuss a problem in pairs, then you discuss it in fours, and then you come together. For example, there can be a way of using that across time, which maybe you end up with 2 half-an-hour meetings instead of like one really long one, but the quality of the conversations is better as well. Yeah. So I'm just thinking that there's a lot of room for experimenting in meeting structure and mixing that with synchronous and asynchronous. And the other thing is that really looking at breaking down, and this takes a lot of thought, which is the problem, thought on time. But Parable, for example, who are a distributed company, they've got, they have a template for making asynchronous decisions, which they make in Slack, which has, okay, what is the first step? Someone proposes something. Then the second step is people ask questions about it. Then the third step. So they've got like 6 steps. And for example, there's ways of saying, okay, we could do step 1 and 2 asynchronously. We can use the meeting for step 3, and then we can go. So I think that it's this mix and this understanding that the online space works better with smaller groups of people, that we get better conversations and seeing how. So it's huge, Brian. And the problem is that we need the time, and then we don't have, so I think it's a really important question. Yeah, thank you.
And thank you so much, Pilar, because it tied into, so Nikki was asking, what is 1, 2, 4 all? Ines, thank you for posting the link because I couldn't find it fast enough. But in short, if you're not familiar with the technique, somebody ask a question, you've got a few minutes by yourself, that's the 1, to think about it. Then you pair up with somebody, that's the 2, to discuss what you came up with. Then the 2, you get 2 pairs together, that's the 4. To talk about, okay, what are the top things maybe we came up with? What do we want to carry forward to everyone, the larger group? There's variations on that, and there's ways to do it synchronously and asynchronously. So I can't remember if we did this in one of our sessions, Pilar, or not. I know I've done it in retrospectives where you might do the one as like a question on Slack to the team, say, hey, I want you to think about this question today, And then tomorrow, I want you to pair up with somebody to talk about it briefly. You can talk about it, as long as you want, or 5 minutes, it doesn't matter, but just touch base with somebody. And it may be in Slack, it may be live. So maybe you start up a Slack huddle or Zoom or whatever. And then you might come together and say, okay, we're going to bring everyone together in a live session. We're going to go in breakouts here in Zoom, and I'm going to put you in groups of 4 to talk about what did your pairs come up with. And so there's ways to mix the synchronous and the asynchronous with some of these techniques as well. So again, experiment with if you've got to have the meetings, experiment with how you can make some of it offline and some altogether. And we are very close on time. And I apologize, I have another client meeting at top of the hour. So.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for your time, Mark. And thank you everybody for all your super valuable questions that you've raised today as well. It has been great. I've been thoroughly enjoyed this. So I know that, let me just, that we have a feedback because we like to get our feedback. Yes, and it's already, Renee, that's lovely. Thank you. It's already in the chat. So please, if you can take a little bit of time, it takes about, I don't know, a minute and a half or something to just give us some feedback because we constantly want to improve. But yeah, that would be great. And Mark, thank you. We won't take up more of your time either. That's it. That's it for tonight.
I saw Renee's card. I thought he was going to give me an Elmo. So enough. Let's move on. Thank you, Renee. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I apologize for the shorter session, but you can reach me online. You can reach me in email. I do respond to email, I promise. Just not my favorite way to have a long discussion. So. But thank you so much for taking time out of your day, your evening. And thank you, Helen and Ines, for hosting. Wonderful.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. And good to see old friends too. Bye.